Before I made my first trip to the Appalachian Trail, I had done a lot of hiking. I had been on multiple backpacking trips, and I thought I had the skills it would take to prevent my feet from having problems with blisters. When I started hiking on the AT, I discovered I was wrong about that. I did get blisters. And to prevent more blisters from happening, I had to change my approach and my footwear in ways that I could not have anticipated previously. We're going to talk about problems one can encounter with their feet when trying to hike hundreds of miles on the AT. We're going to talk about what I did to eliminate problems for myself. Before I went to the Appalachian Trail, I had always followed what was pretty much 20th century advice on footwear and blisters regarding hiking. I wore well-constructed boots. They were well broken in. I'd use them a lot. And I wore nice, thick socks. In my earlier hiking and backpacking, that approach worked fine. On the Appalachian Trail, it worked poorly. So we need to answer the question, why was the Appalachian Trail different than the other backpacking and hiking I had done earlier? The answer centers on two facts. The first is I was working much harder on the Appalachian Trail than I had on any of my other trips. And secondly, I was sweating a lot more than I had on my earlier trips. On that first Appalachian Trail trip, I was moving as fast as I could. I was trying to cover as many miles as I could. I was walking day after day. That was a lot of physical effort, and that physical effort created a lot of perspiration, especially when we consider the forest along the AT as something of a humid environment compared to some other areas of the country like out west. And blisters started to give me problems almost immediately. So what was I wearing on that first trip? I was wearing tall leather boots that I was told would protect my feet and support my ankles. I was also wearing thick socks that I was told would protect my feet from blisters. What actually happened with that footwear is my feet sweated badly. Blisters showed up quick. All of that perspiration made my socks wet. They made my feet wet. I frequently had to pause, take off my shoes, take off my socks, let them air out. I was fortunate in the sense that I had the presence of mind to take some first aid tape with me, so I taped those blisters up and kept tape on for the duration of the hike. Another thing that happened is at one point I jumped off a rock about 18 inches high. I was wearing my pack, weighed about 35 pounds, and I twisted one ankle enough to keep me limping for the duration of the hike. Very quickly, it became obvious to me that my main problem was I was getting no ventilation from my footwear, and I would have been much better off if I had had shoes that were not as tall. On subsequent trips, I used below-the-ankle shoes, also made of leather, and they worked fine until it started raining. On a later trip with those new shoes, I ran into a lot of rain. Those shoes got wet, they stayed wet, and I got the nastiest blister I ever had. During that trip, I was still wearing thick socks. I had a thick pair of synthetic socks. My thinking was they would dry out more quickly than cotton, yet they became soaking wet, and nothing I could do would dry them out. They were perpetually damp. After I went home and healed up, I returned to the AT later, and this time I had a pair of 100% synthetic trail running shoes. For those who don't know, synthetic material will dry out much quicker than leather. I also scrapped the thick socks. As I said, the ones I had previously got very wet. They were so wet for so long, it seemed to me nothing was going to dry them out short of a trip to a laundromat. So instead I switched to wearing multiple pairs of thin nylon socks. I decided that thin socks would dry out much quicker than thick socks, no matter what the circumstances. I also decided that wearing two pairs of thin nylon socks would help cut down friction because I would have sock sliding on sock, and that would reduce rubbing on my skin. I also developed a new morning routine on the Appalachian Trail. Every morning I would tape my feet at the spots that had a high risk of blisters, my big toes, the heels of my feet, the balls of my feet. Over that tape I would put a lubricant, either Vaseline or a product called Body Glide. Then I would put on my two pairs of thin socks, lace the shoes up tight, and off I would go. The old advice is if you feel a hot spot on your foot, to stop immediately, take your shoes off, your socks off, examine it, see if you've got a blister developing. That's pretty good advice if you notice those hot spots, but on the AT I got blisters without even noticing a hot spot in advance. Another habit I developed was wearing nothing but thin black nylon socks. Now, that is not a very fashionable thing to be wearing when you're hiking, but the reason I did it is that my experience is that anything black will dry out in the outdoors much quicker than anything white. That's also why my backpack was black, why my umbrella was black. Any item that I could purchase in a black color, I would buy simply because it would dry out more quickly. Another factor is those synthetic running shoes had insoles. I could take those insoles out when I was in my tent overnight, and I'd put them out in the sun later when I could. Another thing is my hiking experience demonstrated to me, sooner or later, one is very likely to encounter conditions in which it is absolutely impossible to keep your feet dry. Basically, the deal is, one day in heavy rain, I was going uphill and the trail turned into a drainage ditch. The water was running ankle deep. The terrain on either side of the trail was pretty steep. There was really nowhere to go except to slosh right through it. That left me with the conclusion that it is a great benefit on the AT for the long-distance hiker to have footwear and socks that will dry out as quickly as possible. The question can be asked, can a person wear leather hiking shoes on the AT and get by with no problem? Many times I have encountered another hiker who was wearing what were obviously leather hiking shoes in wet conditions. Every time I was able, I would ask that person, say, are your feet dry inside those shoes? Every time they would say, no, they're wet. There was one exception to this. At a shelter, one fellow in leather shoes told me his feet were dry. He took his shoes off, put his sandals on, wandered off. I checked the inside of those leather shoes and they were wet. Yet it's also true that if a thru hiker is northbound and starts off in the spring, odds are good that thru hiker will encounter snow early in their hike. If I was going to thru hike under those circumstances, I would bite the bullet. I would buy some high leather shoes, some decent leather shoes with Gore-Tex. I would probably use wool socks because wool socks do perform very well, and I'd hope for the best. Even under that scenario, when the spring warmed up and there was no more risk of snow, I would send those leather shoes home and I'd switch to synthetic shoes. Now, it could be there's some kind of leather hiking shoe out there somewhere that's so magical it would solve all these problems, and if that product does exist, I don't know what it would be. I have no knowledge of it. I also have to tell you about one time when my footwear approach for the Appalachian Trail failed. My daughter accompanied me on one trip to the Appalachian Trail. Before we left home, I went shopping with her to buy shoes and socks. When we got on the AT, on the second day, she told me one of her big toes was rubbing on the toe box of her shoe, and the toe was starting to swell. Because the toe was swollen, I hesitated to wrap it in tape, and I took the attitude that, well, maybe it will just swell a little bit, not get any worse, and that was a very bad call. We had a long way to hike. We finished that distance, and when she got home, she saw a doctor. The short story is she ended up seeing a podiatrist. She had her toenail removed. She had to make several visits to that podiatrist, and it was a period of weeks recovering from that injury she got on the Appalachian Trail. It was after we got back home that it really began to sink in how I had fallen asleep at the wheel and was a terrible hiking partner for not realizing how potentially bad that toe was. In retrospect, I think what I should have done was cut a hole in those shoes to reduce the abrasion on that toe. And if faced with a choice like that again, I would not hesitate to cut a hole in a shoe. Our toes and our feet are more valuable than our shoes. Now the question can be asked, was I sacrificing support for my feet by wearing those running shoes? I certainly was influenced by the fact that by the time I went to that footwear, my pack on the AT was averaging about 25 pounds, so I wasn't carrying that much weight. I was also influenced by walking over the millions of big rocks that sometimes cover the AT. My thinking was that if my ankles weren't strong enough to handle those rocks, no pair of footwear was going to overcome that kind of deficiency. And it's also true that I found those kinds of rocks much less fatiguing if I took the time to look for flat spots and put my feet on those flat spots when I could find them. Okay, we are done. I hope it wasn't too long-winded, but I wanted to be thorough because on the AT there aren't very many things as important as your feet. And as always, thanks for watching.